Okay, so I've been talking about this idea of contingency planning and identifying risks. So let's just stop and talk a little bit about that. Whenever we do any sort of planning, we should also consider things that could possibly go wrong. What can go wrong with my plan that can stop me from achieving my end goal or stop me from achieving my end goal in the way that I'm predicting it should occur? What are the consequences of those things occurring? What's the likelihood? Do I seriously take those things occurring? And what actions should I take to deal with it? So what steps should I take dependent on the assessment I've just done in terms of the likelihood and the consequences? So plans don't always go smoothly from start to finish, and that's just the nature of what we do. Things shift all the time, but what we want to do is we want to try and preempt as much as possible. Contingency planning can help us to have like a backup plan or some type of alternative strategy if required. So, we're going to use this particular supplier. This 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 supplier supplying a good or service at a particular time is critical to the success of our plan. So we're going to have a backup plan in case anything goes wrong. We're going to have supplier B on standby in case, or we've got an alternative way of dealing with it if that's the case. So that would be an example of some contingency. But in some cases, we may not have a backup plan. In some cases, we may actually have an alternative strategy, or we might want to put something in place to avoid that risk altogether. And that might be part of a risk assessment or risk management plan that we have. So I want to talk a little bit about the concept of risk management in planning. But before I do that, I just want to talk about the risk management framework. So any form of risk management that we do, we should be first identifying the scope of the risk management. So in this case, the scope is the plan. So where we start thinking about where risks can start and where we end with our where can risks have an impact up to, it's really the scope of our plan. So if our plan is about implementing a new software or upgrading the current software system, our scope would would be for risk would be within those parameters. So we establish the context, and within that context, we think about things. And I don't want to get too prescriptive about this because there's a likelihood you'll be doing a separate risk assessment unit as part of this qualification. But there are certain things also we want to consider within there, such as what's the appetite for risk within the organization and so forth. But we establish the context, then we identify the risks. Risks are things that can potentially go wrong. Then we analyze those risks. How seriously do we think these these risks? How seriously do we think that these risks can occur, and what are the consequences if they occur? What are the impacts if they do occur? What's going to be the consequences if we allow it to go, and so forth. So we do this analysis, we evaluate as a result of that, and then dropping out of that evaluation on how seriously we take it, we then treat that risk. And treating the risk is really about taking action on that risk, and we'll talk more about that as we go along in this topic. Supporting those steps of identifying, analyzing, evaluating, and treating, we should be communicating and consulting with all key stakeholders. So that is two ways. We should be asking, getting people's input around what type of risks, what are the consequences and likelihood, and what are some of the recommended treatments. We should also be feeding that back. So when we're taking action, saying this is what we're going to do and how we're going to do it and when it's going to happen and so forth. And we should also be monitoring and reviewing those actions that we've taken and whether they're working or not. So whether they're hitting the mark as we expected, or whether they're not quite doing the job that we thought that they might, and we need to go back and tweak or rehash altogether. So let's break each of these down. Identifying the risk. So embedded with what I was just talking about. So it's ways that we can identify the risk. We've done our draft plan, depending on the size of the plan, depending on the endeavor that we're undertaking. What what are some of the things that we perceive or we think potentially could go wrong? And to do that, we should be consulting. We should be consulting with internal stakeholders such as staff, be they managers and executives, whether they be team members, whether they be people who have some type of heritage in what we're doing, experience and so forth. We should be consulting with any records that we have, any record keeping. So, for example, if you have a lessons learned or you have some type of journal or logs or statistics available from previous similar endeavors, we can be sourcing that to identify risks. So we might find from some type of journal or lessons learned the last time that we had a software upgrade that these are some of the things that went wrong. And we can learn from that and help that feed into our risk assessment, our analysis of our plans. Uh, and we can also consult internally through things like brainstorming, SWOT analysis, which SWOT is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, or just interviews with key stakeholders, internal key stakeholders. Like I said, team members, executives. It could be people in other areas, uh, um, multidisciplinary teams, and so forth. We can also consult externally. Externally is where we go outside the organization. We might look to talk to consultants who specialize in the area. So if it's an IT example, there'll be IT consultants out there we can go to who have had similar situations. If I'm working for a government department, for example, and we're doing software upgrade, some of the other departments have undergone recent upgrades, we can consult with those. Still within the broader family of the public service, but um, purely an external, because they're a different organization and there's total different parameters and circumstances around that. We can also consult with suppliers. Some of our suppliers uh, uh, might be able to provide us with some really good information about potential risks or pitfalls associated with what we're endeavoring to do. We can hold consultations with broader communities as well. In some cases, depending on the nature of what we do, community consultations are also really important. And in that case, you'd explain the scope of what we're endeavoring to do. You'd you would explain the risk process, like I've just explained, and we would talk about things such as our risk appetite. How much risk we're willing to take on board, or we can afford to take on board, in a sense of risk capacity. How much uh, so, for example, how much negative press can we undertake before it becomes problematic, as an example? And usually, when we think about risk factors, one of the really good tools is to think about PESTLE as another acronym, surprise, surprise. And PESTLE can help us to classify different categories of risk. So, it helps us to structure our thinking a little bit when we're breaking down potential risks in what we're doing. So, as part of our plan, we may need to think about uh, things such as political factors, uncertainty, or regulatory or legislative impacts or risks associated with what we're doing. It can be economic in terms of the economy itself, or it can be in terms of our internal economy, financials. We're sure we've got funding at the start. Is there a risk of that funding dollar um, dissipating or perhaps being pulled out from us towards the end of the plans? So that's an example of economic risks. Social risks or social factors in type of things as customer expectations or cultural impacts, social um, social perceptions or perspectives such as social media, technological factors associated with risks such as the equipment, having issues with new equipment or inability to get particular equipment, software, infrastructure. That can turn into things such as uh, um, people's inability to integrate or use the technology and so forth. Legal factors such as threat of fines or threat of lawsuits or breaches of arrangements or agreements that we may have, or environmental factors, which can be things such as material impacts or noise restrictions or waste management uh, and so forth. So the PESTLE is a really good tool to get us to think about different sections of risks that we may use when we're consulting to identify potential risks to our plan, especially for the more bigger plans. So if we're just doing, so with my simple plan earlier, where we're just doing training for a procedure, we may not need to go through this depth of risk assessment, because the risks, we might think about the risks as we're actually doing our simple plan, and we're thinking about, okay, what if staff are absent? So we might build that into the timing. We go, okay, well, look, there's probably a likelihood that there's going to be some absenteeism. So instead of trying to get all this training done in a month, let's stretch it out to 6 weeks, and we're going to build in the capacity to deal with some of these risks that we've seen, because we only see them as low risks and so forth. So you may not necessarily need to go to this degree. But if you're dealing with a significant goal that is going to feed in significantly to your manager's plans, and you're responsible, it's within your scope of responsibility, because we're talking about diploma level here. So I'm guessing that you're in a position, in a responsibility, or you're foreseen being in a position of responsibility. You want to make sure that if you're responsible for these plans, that you don't get caught uh, in a situation where you haven't considered something, because that's part of your accountability. So risk assessment is a really important part, because we're trying to foresee any of these things that go wrong. So, and you can use tools such as your standard risk assessment matrix, such as this, to determine whether you think that the risk is the assessment of the risk is high, extreme, or low, or very low. And that's a combination of the two factors I was talking about. So if you think the likelihood is rare that something's going to occur, and you think that the consequence is insignificant, using this particular tool on this screen here, with the likelihood being rare, the consequence being insignificant, you're going to determine that the risk is very low. The blue one, very low. However, if you think that the likelihood is almost certain, so we're talking about a specific supplier here, and this supplier has been really unreliable, so we're concerned about the supplier's inability to perhaps not deliver on their commitments as part of our plan, and we think that it's almost certain because they've they're, they've been unreliable in the past. However, there may be even, we may even know of instability within the organization. And because they're a key player, and if they don't supply the product, it stops all of our endeavors, it stops the whole plan from moving forward. We would consider that to be either very high, but in this case, if we determine it's a severe consequence and almost certain, the risk assessment would be at the other end of the scale. It would be the red extreme up at 25. Something that's very low, we might just decide that we're going to deal with. Something that's very high, we need to do something about. So this is where our treatments come into play. So if it's something that is really low, so it's rare, the likelihood is rare, the consequences are insignificant, then we may decide to either retain or accept the risk. Look, it's if this supplier doesn't supply on time, that's okay, because we can just go down to Officeworks and pick up one on the one through there. It might cost us $5 extra, but it won't matter. And Officeworks have always got them in stock. Worst case, if Officeworks don't have it, we'll pick it up at another stationery supplier. Then we will just accept it, because we don't need to spend any more energy in dealing with that. However, that's different to if it's really high. If that's the case, we need to do something about it, because that would be a duty of care to do something about it. So other type of risk treatments that we could do, and I'm working from the bottom up, so I just talked about retain or accept. The next one up is that we could share or transfer the risk. So we might contract multiple suppliers, or we might put something into the supplier's contract to say, if you do not supply, there's going to be these monetary fines, and then that'll allow us to have another supplier on backup, even if it's going to cost us more, because those monetary fines are going to counterbalance that. Or we may decide to mitigate or reduce the risk by doing things that is going to make us minimize either the likelihood or the consequences, and that's that's more in line with the contingency planning that I was talking about before. So if if it's a supplier, if it's a supplier of something, say we're doing a software upgrade and it's a supplier of a particular piece of equipment that's really critical, we might, to mitigate the risk, we might get that delivered to us 2 weeks before we need it, because that way, if it doesn't get there, it gives us 2 weeks to get it from somewhere else, and we know that that's possible. So that's an example of a mitigation or a reduction. Or we might just eliminate or avoid the risk altogether, even though another supplier is going to cost us more money. We're going to go with another supplier so that we avoid that risk altogether, or we can reduce it down anyway by using a supplier that's been assessed to be more reliable, even though they cost more. So there's a range of risks that we can do, and 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 then depending again on the size of the plan, if it's a significant endeavor, we would then create some type of risk register or risk management plan that captures everything that we just talked about. We would describe the risk, we would describe the impact on what we're trying to do, we would grade the likelihood and seriousness depending on which tool we're using. So if it was one earlier, it would be something like very low or rare or likely, and make a determination, or we might be using the numerical system within that. But we make our assessment of the risk. We then um, if in the change one, if it's been an existing risk, say it's been assessed as a risk previously, and we identify it as an existing risk that has had some type of assessment done previously, we would put in what the current assessment is. We would put in the whether there's been a change since its last review and the date of the last review. But then we would then put under mitigating or mitigation actions what we're now proposing to do or what we're going to do to deal with that risk or treat that risk. And then who's responsible for that? We would identify any costs and set a timeline. And they're the steps that we would take to ensure that we have captured all the risks, assess those risks, and put in treatments to deal with those risks. So we would go through a 6-step process, such as the one on this slide. We would identify the potential problem. We would get the facts. What's the likelihood? What's the consequences? Do the assessment of the risk. Determine the appropriate action to take, the treatment. We would pick the most effective one. We would implement it, and then we would do the follow-up. And that follow-up is really critical, the review, to make sure that it's hitting the mark,